name is Danielle Savoy, and I teach kindergarten at the Maury Elementary School in Lowell, Massachusetts. And I've taught pre-K, K1 and 2 over the past 27 years, but kindergarten is really my niche.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Lisa Scaff. I teach sixth grade math and science in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. In the past, I have taught fourth grade also in Chelmsford, and I also taught sixth grade at the Academy of Notre Dame in Tingsboro. That was my first full-time teaching position, and I was there for 4 years. So I've had a little experience teaching in the private schools section, and then public school as well.
My name's Jody Ahern. I've been teaching at Lowell High School for 26 years. I teach math in a variety of topics, grades 9 through 12. It varies each year. Mostly, I teach remedial algebras, and then I will teach high honors in the Latin Lyceum program. So I see a wide array of students with math ability. And I've been a long member of the community. I attended Lowell High School and I teach at Lowell High School, and my family attended Lowell High School. So it's been a beautiful journey for me.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mariel Roberts. I'm a term assistant professor at Barnard College. I study most generally how our visual attention affects the earliest aspects of our vision. So I'm a perceptual scientist. I do experimental psychology experiments, but I'm really interested in kind of the underlying brain mechanisms. So I think I'm at the intersection of cognitive neuroscience and in experimental psychology. I teach different classes, but I teach labs, which are more kind of practical, experiment-driven classes in perception, as well as in introduction labs to experimental psychology. I'll be teaching statistics coming up, so just getting started. It's really fun so far.
Thanks for inviting me. My background is in international economic development, and I've been teaching at the Yale School of Management for almost 15 years now on what's termed social enterprise, which is using business disciplines and markets to address social issues such as access to sustainable energy, healthcare, education. And yeah, that's who I am.
Hi. Thanks for having me, and it's nice to meet everyone on the panel as well as all the listeners here. I teach at the Sloan School of Management. I am perhaps the most confused of the lot here. I call myself a socio-technologist. My education began in engineering but ended in social sciences, at the intersection of engineering and social science. My work is on building socio-technical systems, in other words, just systems where there's both human complexity and technological complexity for underserved communities. And that's what I also teach at MIT.
So thank you all. We have a great selection of people here, so I'm super excited. And so this year has obviously been different for all of us, and I know we hear that over and over, and we're tired of hearing that. So first, I would like to ask and start on the good side of things. What are the advantages of teaching during a global pandemic?
I've actually been thinking about this a lot because, of course, there's a tendency, I think, right now to focus on what children are losing at this time. And I teach a fully remote kindergarten setting, and have been doing so for the past year. And I really think that there have been some advantages. I really do. I feel like I've more intimately connected with the families of my students. I'm right in their living room, and many of the parents, not all, but many of the parents are right there with us during class time. So I do have students who are dropped off to a neighbor or dropped off to a family member, or even I actually have one child who's in daycare and Zooms in from the daycare. So they're not all with their families, but they're not all with their parents or guardians, but I really do feel like I'm getting a clearer picture of the challenges they face, of their cultural perspectives. I'm getting a clearer picture of what they understand and how I can reach them at their level in a more intimate way. So it's really been eye-opening, and I think it will definitely change the way I teach moving forward.
As like Danielle said, I feel like a lot of times we're focusing on the negative side of all of this happening, but it is, you know, enlightening to sort of stop and say, what are some of the good things? I do feel like a lot of kids have gained a lot of technology skill that they maybe were not proficient at before. Also typing skills, that's always been something at my grade level where until now we've said if only kids had better typing skills, we could move away from paper pencil tasks for students that, you know, find difficulty working in that mode. I also feel it has allowed me to differentiate instruction more easily because I can you know, post different assignments in Google Classroom and assign them to certain groups of students based on, you know, their individual needs. And it also allows the kids to have more choice in their learning because I can post multiple things, multiple assignments in one classroom hub, and then kids can pick and choose which assignments they're going to complete for, you know, a day or a week of time. So those are some of the things I feel like have been a positives. And also Danielle's right. I think this is going to change the way I present information moving forward. Now I know that I can manage this and the kids can manage this style of learning. I think I will keep some aspects of it.
So I think the piece that surprised me the most in a positive way was that I was still able to make these connections with high school students. So different from elementary school, my students don't tend to have parents nearby when they're doing their work. And I don't often see many faces. A lot of students choose not to share their backgrounds behind them while they're learning, but I'm still making those connections. And I'm surprised at how widespread that goes. So whether, you know, students can pick up very quickly if I'm having a bad day or if they're having a bad day, I can pick that up and then they support each other through that as well. So that's something that's always important to me in the classroom, to have that comfortable place, even though it is a math classroom, and I still feel like it's happening remotely. So I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, I agree with everyone who's spoke before. I think that I was surprised at the degree of community that we were able to cultivate. I think I was a little nervous about this, right? We usually interact on this energy level, but I think something about flattening everyone to like the same plane, there's something very intimate. I feel like I can see all of the students, all of their faces if they choose to keep their cameras on, that I may not get if I was in a bigger lecture hall where there might be some students in the back who may be too nervous or shy to speak up. And I think there's some kind of an equalizing plane in that extent. From a kind of teaching perspective, I think it's been great for us to reassess, like what is the objective of every lesson? And you have to get creative with mixing up the activities. I think particularly in college courses, there's this tendency to say, okay, I have my lecture content I need to get through, but I think this has been a great shakeup in a way to say, oh, students' attention is not going to be on that screen for, you know, longer than 15 minutes at a time max, I'd say. And maybe that differs, but depending on the age group, I'd like to hear from others. So it forces me to be more creative and say, okay, I'm going to take breaks here, I'm going to interact and make activities and have active learning exercises where they interact, you know, in the breakout rooms. And that's been really, I think, the most productive is when they're actually able to work with each other rather than me talking at them. So I think it's actually been a really good philosophical question, like what is the best way of engaging with them? And I think, like others, I'm going to carry that forward. That's not going to change even if we go back to in person.
I think for me, it just popped me off of autopilot. You know, after 27 years of teaching primarily kindergarten, I'd like to think I still had extreme energy and joy, but it really did pop me off of autopilot. I had to stop and think, what's important here? And how am I going to, you know, because I can't hit every point, so I have to choose the one that really matters the most.
My students are mostly MBA students, some international affairs, environment school, law school, public health. So it's a different set of challenges. But for me, what's been great, and which I will certainly keep, is the ability to bring in guest speakers so easily, right? Yeah. Whether it's, even saving somebody a trip from New York to New Haven, let alone California or India or Kenya or Brazil. It's really opened that up. And I think historically there's been a sense of distance. Obviously that option's always been there, before Zoom there was Skype, and some professors did it. I mostly didn't, because it felt like it was depriving the students of an experience of directly engaging with people. So I would only invite guest speakers who could actually physically come. But I think after this, it's really imprinted that this is a perfectly legitimate and useful way of engaging with outsiders. And so it really opens up the world of what I can bring into my classes. And I can bring somebody in for half an hour, or I can bring in 3 people for an hour and have a discussion about something. So that's been a real boon for how I conceive of the structure of time in a classroom.
So Professor Vaishnav, how has this been different for you? And I know that you do research, so I wanted to ask you specifically about that as well.
Yeah, so, well, I think I agree with all of the observations. Yes, my last year has been much more in research than in teaching. And quite rightly, the question that arises is that, okay, what matters here? And in some ways, maybe to be a little bit provocative, one realized very early on that there is something other than education that matters more than education. So in other words, probably education is not a basic need in some ways. We've constructed the world that in which it has become a very strong, very important need. But you can survive if you were not in classroom for some time, a year of your life. It's okay. It's all right. Ultimately, learning is important so that you can, have a good life, but also meet your basic needs more easily. It's the easiest path to meeting your needs in some ways. All the other paths seem more risky and so on, right? And I think the opportunity for me in terms of teaching and learning this past year has been in learning adaptation very aggressively, right? And I think if you really sort of ask why we educate ourselves and what is the advantage of it, from the evolution perspective, I think the advantage is that we can adapt fast, right? So that we can survive. And so adaptation has been the theme in research also. I could say more about exactly how we adapted to various situations. When labs were closed, not accessible. The field visits were all gone, and so not accessible. And still, we had to keep learning. And I think we did. In fact, we learned some aspects that we wouldn't have learned otherwise. So that's what it's been like.
That's some of those advantages, but you also touched on some of the disadvantages. So on the flip side, I want to ask, what are some of the disadvantages of teaching and educating during this whole pandemic? Now, also add maybe something you miss the most about teaching in person.
So I think in my research, there are 3 components, I would say. There's something that you can learn from library research. That component was not affected. There's something that you must learn from the field, because a lot of this work is targeted to underserved communities. That component was not possible. Travel, etc., was significantly hampered. There were aspects of it that could be done by telephones and so on. But if you say that, okay, in terms of the field, you're trying to not only understand, observe you're not only trying to understand what people say and say and think, but you're also trying to understand what they do and how they live and all that. That part was much harder to do. The lab experiments have been significantly impacted in some ways. It has led to reimagining the lab itself. So that has been a positive. But I think the field and the lab, I think, were slowed down.
I think the real disadvantage in some ways is what would be happening outside the classroom. We can still teach and it's constrained, but we can adapt and we maybe come up with some interesting ways to do that. But for students, mostly in their mid-20s who are refocusing their careers, I'd say at least as important as what goes on in the classroom is what goes on outside the classroom in terms of the community, the informal engagements with peers, the job searches, interviews, all that. And that's just been totally torn apart. And that's much harder to try to weave together a viable fabric for students' experience. So for those who are second-year students now, they will have had 3 quarters in the classroom and then 5 quarters out of the classroom. And there's no real way to give them the experiences that they would have had. And there's the schools trying to do a number of things of open up future exchange programs and promising to bring them back for formal graduation ceremonies. But that sort of social capital that is so important in developing a new orientation professionally, that they're just missing out on. I feel really badly about that.
That ties in very well. It completely resonates what everyone has said before. I think in terms of what I missed just quickly is just that buzz, that energy when you're first in that classroom, and that more casual, informal interaction that you don't really get. It's a little bit more formal, although you still can talk to the students. I agree. I think that students' mental health is extremely affected, and there has been very encouragingly in the past decade maybe a really concerted effort to talk about mental health, and at least in the college environment. And we realize more and more that it's really essential. Like without the community cohesion, they don't have any really motivation to stay focused and stay on top of their schoolwork. And so it is really hard, I think, from the student's perspective. I think from a teacher's perspective, there are always kind of inequities in terms of where students are coming from, in terms of maybe their socioeconomic background or whatever advantages or disadvantages they're coming from. And in theory, when they're brought into a college classroom, those differences they try to be minimized. I don't know if it's effective all the time, but I think when you're on Zoom and they're living at home a lot of the times, these inequities are exacerbated, and those students who are already at a disadvantage are put in a much worse position. They may not have, stable Wi-Fi connections, which is just a very practical limitation to their learning. They may be having to work extra jobs, or having to take care of people who are sick, or family members, or do childcare or parent care. And, that's just something that is out of my reach, that I try to support the students as much as I can, but it's a really challenging it's a huge challenge.
I feel terrible about, equally about, students not having the opportunity, the usual opportunity that one would expect if they are in college and so on. But in some ways, if we sort of, again, step back and say, okay, what are we trying to do that we can't do that is so fundamental to us or our own sanity? And I think that is this social interaction, right? Peer learning, social interaction, not being lonely, etc. And I think from that perspective, we really can't answer this question without thinking about societal structure as a complement to educational structure. So in some ways, if we had ways of, in some societies, Like if you look at the Eastern world versus Africa versus American setting that we are in and so on, in some societies, the social structure does provide for that that learn alternate paths of that learning. It's a different kind. It's not mediated by education. It's mediated by something else, but it continues to happen efficiently, whereas in other societies it's harder and so on.
For me, as a math teacher, and especially for my lower level students, I struggle providing them with the answers to their questions. And the biggest difficulty that arises is that they don't have a strong enough mathematical background to properly ask a question. So when they're struggling, I typically just hear that I don't get it. And then I have to use my background knowledge to imagine where they might be finding difficulty. So that has been my number one issue. And then in addition to just seeing my high school students struggle with the inequities of their family backgrounds, and just trying to support that as best I can and encourage. And I think myself included, a lot of times people in high school, we like to go to this building to build other relationships and to sometimes not have to be at home to work on those relationships. And so not having that break from your family members or from your chores or, I think that's been a little bit of a struggle for a lot of people.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think sometimes, I'll hear from parents, this is the way my child behaves at home, and I'll say, oh, they don't behave that way at school. So I think even 5-year-olds walk into a school building and they may not consciously think about it, but they have the opportunity to reinvent themselves a little bit.
Yeah.
To be different. I'm going to be different in this setting. I'm going, this is how I'm going to be in this setting. This is who I am here. And they've lost that. Of course, they can't, they're not thinking about it that probably in those terms, but they're at home, and they have to be their home self and their school self at the same time. I think even for 5 and 6-year-old children, it's really a struggle. When you think about it, I think all of us, we walk out of our homes and we walk into our workplaces, and you're slightly different. You're a different version of yourself. And so, we've lost that too. I'm working from home, and or I'm living at work. I'm not quite sure. I think it's the second one. I'm the teacher in this room, I'm the mom in this room, I'm the wife in this room, and it's all in the same building. But if I could just say one thing that I really miss about teaching in person is that for a kindergarten teacher, it's a beautiful thing to be a fly on the wall and just during choice time and just listening, watching the children play with each other. And that is something that I've lost over the past year. It's amazing just to see which children are going to choose which centers to play in, and the little conversations that they're having with each other that are not directed by me. It's a great chance for me to be a spy, and I can pick up on some, oh, I didn't know that you were interested in dinosaurs, or I didn't know you were interested in cooking. And so I could pick up on that and weave that into my next lesson. Or I can sometimes correct misconceptions. I can hear things that they say to each other that maybe I realize, oh, I need to talk about that. I need to talk about that social issue. That's a misconception that they have. So that's tough because they don't really have a chance to talk to each other without me being there.
Everything that everybody has said so far, I can completely connect with and agree with. One area that I still feel like it's so disappointing for me is my students that are diagnosed with significant learning disabilities, our ability to support them in ways that they need has really been stifled. You know, we're trying to support these kids who need redirection, who need things read to them, who need, you know, people to track their test items and whatnot. Like so many different accommodations, it's just not possible to provide those in the way these kids need. And, you know, with that, my classroom setting was always one where we would work in cooperative groups, and many things were hands-on. And so I felt like those experiences working in a cooperative group with peer support, teacher support, and hands-on really benefited those kids that needed that, you know, that was their best learning style. That's where they were most successful. And so that has kind of been a downer, that we're not able to provide that right now.
So to move away from the pandemic, we can always come back. I wanted to ask some other questions in general about learning and teaching, because I would not know, and people like me would not, and students like me would not understand from your point of view. So we wanted to hear what you thought. So one question that might be a little debate is, what are your thoughts on standardized testing? And do you believe that it accurately assesses a student's ability and what they've learned and throughout the year?
I don't know. This is a loaded question, as I'm sure everyone agrees. I think standardized testing provides data. There's so much more to a testing situation than just, you know, sit down, you take the test, and that's where you're at. I think we have to think about kids' emotional and social abilities, you know, test anxiety, what was their morning like before they took the test, what was the night like before they took the test. So all of those things, I think, have an impact on yourself as a test taker, how you're going to actually take the exam. I do think it provides data that we can use to inform ourselves as educators. It bothers me when we make those results, you know, high stakes. Like, what do we do with the data? That's where I run into, you know, what kind of decisions are we making about kids and schools and districts based on test scores? That's where I kind of struggle.
Lisa had mentioned that we have these high stakes testing, and in Massachusetts, we do have the MCAS. What happens is, by the time they get to high school, this MCAS test now determines whether or not students will graduate. And so we have lots of years of data, and sometimes the data is students are doing fantastic, sometimes it's otherwise, and all of a sudden they've been promoted, and we at the high school level have to find a way to fill in so many gaps, right? Sometimes 6 years, 7 years of gaps in their education, and trying to match the high school curriculum for students to fill in those gaps, and at the same time prepare them for their experiences after high school can be a challenge. But I'm not against standardized testing. I do think that we need to find a way that we can assess students and their ability, and be able to place them where they need to be placed. And it is hard because sometimes, like as Lisa said, there's different situations that happen the day of testing or before testing. But we need some way to assess them overall, right, in all communities, and be able to say a certain piece of score or a certain piece of data.
So I would just add, standardized certainly means the test is standardized, but it also implies that the students taking the test are standardized. Yeah. And we know enough now to know that's not true. And obviously there's accommodations for certain things, but I think we need to rethink what we're trying to test and how to do that better, so that whether it's learning differences or language or cultural aspects or past education, that what we're capturing, really is aptitude rather than purely accomplishment. I appreciate, particularly say in high school, I have a 16-year-old son who's taking geometry now. There's a certain level of accomplishment and mastery that needs to be achieved, but is there a way to test for it or gauge it in ways that appreciate and respect the array of backgrounds that students are coming from?
Just a perspective, probably at the other end of the spectrum. My struggle is to want to standardize a bit, because the setting in my class is typically in every semester. So the course that I teach on technology design and entrepreneurship for emerging communities, every semester there are some 60, 65 students in it. They come from anywhere from 10 to 15 different disciplines of MIT, including engineering, social sciences, humanities, etc. And they have very different methodologies, very different problems. So it's almost as if it's hard to satisfy anybody fully. And then what we're trying to test is really a step behind, maybe along 3 dimensions that, have you understood the problem of the community whose problem you're trying to solve as empathetically as possible? Do you have tools for that? Have you determined what research you are going to do and how to do it rigorously? Do you have tools for that? And can you articulate how a seasoned practitioner would take your output from your work to the field, be it an entrepreneur, be it an NGO, be it a policymaker, etc. Do you have tools for that? And their tool sets are totally different, but we're trying to establish some common way of understanding, have they learned what they need to learn? So I have to, alongside, continue to sort of learn because they're each trying to do a different thing. And at times I, in fact, miss the fact that there is no single yardstick that makes it easier for them and me in a way.
If I could bounce off of that. I've definitely considered this question more in reference to SAT or ACT, these kind of standardized tests, as a perhaps entry point or not entry point into college. And I hear maybe in the K through 12, there's lots of more standardized testing, and you're the pros, and I agree. In kindergarten, which is amazing. I agree. I'm a scientist, right? So I appreciate data. But I'm also very skeptical in its utility sometimes, depending on whether the test is actually measuring what it claims to measure. For the SAT, ACT in particular, are you, from my perspective, my humble opinion, you're measuring the student's ability to take that test, which is a time-pressured test that, personally, I didn't do very well on these tests. I felt way too much pressure, and I don't think it was a good measure of my potential as a college student, which, in my opinion, the markers of that are you going to be engaged in critical thinking? Are you going to be able to really, think at a deeper level? So that's one aspect of what are we actually measuring. And just to go back to one of my earlier points, the inequities in terms of resources that students have, it just really makes that problem much worse. They may not have the financial support to get course prep. They may not have the extra time to practice and take the test multiple times if they have jobs. So I think that, again, that's a big disadvantage. And there is, it is a controversial hot topic, but there is some evidence from studies to show that, even the way these tests are constructed tend to be biased to favor white students, because it's the expressions, and particularly the verbal sections, that are used in white communities. And any test that I think biases against, according to different, I guess, racial groups, or however you want to divide it, to me needs to be reassessed. But I have strong opinions that I know there's lots of debate about this. So.
I definitely have strong opinions on over-testing in kindergarten, and over-testing in general, and it's a a battle that I've fought for the past 27 years. I have to give my children 9 phonics subtests and every 6 weeks until they meet the end of the year benchmark. So in October, why would they be meeting the end of the year benchmark for kindergarten? And then we talk about, what we're going to do if they don't meet that end of the year benchmark, and maybe they should be in an intervention group. And I'm famous for saying they are in an intervention group. It's called kindergarten. I know one thing for sure. I have this year, my kindergarten students have taken their assessments online at home. But last year, in the past couple of years, we've taken a certain assessment 3 times each year, October, February, and May. And it's an online assessment, and we've done it in our computer lab at my school. So I'm walking around while they're taking the test. And kindergartners are famous, many of them are famous for thinking out loud. So I have stood behind a child who has talked his way straight to the right answer of a test and then chosen the wrong one. I have stood behind a child who has talked her way into the wrong answer of the test and then chosen the right one. So having seen that so many times, my faith in the validity of the test is very low. It's very low. They're distracted, they're looking around, they're seeing what their friends are looking at and what their friends' screens, and they're choosing, they might just choose that button. I'm going to choose that button because that letter's in my name. And it's very difficult. It really is. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I chose my college based on the fact that that SATs were optional for submission when I applied. And so I went to Bowdoin College, and Bowdoin was the first college, I believe, to make SATs optional. And I thought other schools would quickly jump on board. And many have, but not an overwhelming number. Right. And this year, SATs became optional due to the pandemic. Will that stick? Will that stay? I would wonder. I'm wondering to my higher education folks here.
I don't know if they made at Barnard, they made it optional the last year. And I think there's been discussion, I don't think anything's concrete, that they'll carry this through the future, which I find very encouraging. I think, the culture is changing, thankfully.
How do you feel about the test is one question, but do you feel like a test score accurately reflects a student's abilities? And I remember the wording when I applied to Bowdoin. They said, if you feel that your test scores accurately reflect your abilities, feel free to submit them. And if you don't, feel free to leave them off your resume. And so, I think it depends. You might feel like your test scores are a great piece of your puzzle, but they really have to be looked at as a piece of a very complex puzzle.
Since we're talking about the SAT, I wanted to ask if you believe that every student should go to college.
From the high school setting, part of our job is to help students decide what will happen upon graduation. And I don't believe every student should be going to college, although I think that is a great learning opportunity emotionally and socially beyond the academics. So one of the things I work hard to do within my classroom is to have students recognize if they in fact enjoy school at this point in their life, because they may take some time away from school and decide, actually, I did enjoy learning. And in addition to having that conversation and helping young adults, I start about 16, 17, 18-year-olds. They don't always know what's out there. They don't always know what does college actually look like? What does not going to school feel like. But once they come to whatever decision that might be, a lot of times I have to help students communicate that with their families, because when they're in our classroom, we have their independent learning self, and that can be very different than the way the family perceives them. So overall, no, I don't think every student should go to college. I think if they want the opportunity, I want to help them get that opportunity. But I also want to give students the opportunity to explore other job training areas, things like that.
I'm just going to add on to that, Jody. I think college can mean different things. Like, how are you going to educate yourself to be an adult?
Yeah.
It could be going to a trade school. It could be going to your traditional college type setting. I think it's important for all of us. You know, I know I'm only at the 6th grade level, but Jody, like you said, having kids have the opportunity to understand what happens when you leave high school. You are, you know, probably around 18 years old, and you are an adult, considered an adult in our community, and you are going to be expected to, you know, support yourself in some way, whether it's figuring out the job that you're going to do so that you can make money to live on your own, or are you going to further your education to be, you know, a specific trained professional in something? I do think it's important, like you're saying, to give kids an opportunity to figure out what's out there, what are their options, and maybe college means something different to everybody. You know, it could be learning a trade or going to a traditional college setting.
I can only say, as the father of a 16-year-old, I have to always say, you should go to college.
Yeah. I feel the same. So that was something when Lisa was speaking, I thought how different I treat my students in my classroom versus my children at home. And I try to give my children at home that same grace. And I really want my children at home to be able to explore the way I let my students do. But it's difficult when you think, I'm that parent that has an idea of the path I want my child to go down, and yet I want them to choose it for themselves, but I want them to choose the path that I think is best for them.
I think one of the things the pandemic has kind of brought to light for my daughter is that she was able to sort of see, all right, what are the jobs that we are realizing we can't live without right now? What are the priority things for our society to keep running? What are those? Okay, you know, medical professionals, first responders, educators, you know, truck driver, you know, what are all the jobs that we need as a society to keep running? And then, you know, she was able to see that, you know, some of those jobs require you have a bachelor's, master's, a doctorate degree. You just can't be a physician's assistant. That's going to take some time. Maybe if you want to be, you know, an Amazon driver, that's a little bit different. So I think that was one of the really good conversations we've been having about life beyond high school. You know, how do you see yourself fitting into society? And of course, I would like my daughter to choose college, but I do think it's one of those big choices that has to be somebody makes it for themselves for it to be effective.
I would suggest that going through college is the easiest path to some financial stability. There are other paths to it. It's not a must, but because of the way we structured the market or the economy, this is your easiest path. There are some great counterexamples that are purely out of need. For example, I work with this organization in rural Maharashtra called Vigyan Ashram. They only accept you. It's a trade school that only accepts you if you failed the high school. You can't enter it if you passed it. And they've gone on to do wonderful things. These are some of the best students I've met, most curious, so driven, all of that. Of course it's possible, but that's a minority.
I'm going to quote you to my son. Thank you.
Great.
I know that I've had quite a few friends whose children went to college because the parents felt like it was the only path, and those children ended up either struggling and dropping out, or being just so miserable and dropping out, and so the parents had to come to the conclusion that they had to really sit down and say, who made the decision? And in some cases the child did make the decision, but they realized that college just wasn't for them. I've seen this happen so many times to bright young people.
Mhm.
And they've stepped away from college and they've worked for 5 years and they've gone back when it made sense for them, or they just haven't gone back. So I've started to realize, 10 years ago, I would have said, yes, every child should go to college. And now I don't say that. But I'm glad that my two children are choosing to go to college. So I think it'll just give them more opportunities.
I hear you, and it's not a trivial decision. I mean, it's so expensive. It's insanely expensive these days, and so it's not, oh, you could try it out for even a semester, a year. You're already in crippling student debt for a lot of these students. So I really, it depends on what you envision as a future career, but it's a lot to ask of a high schooler, a lot to ask of a college student to say, what would you like to do with the rest of your life? I think everyone goes through midlife crises at every stage of their lives. So it's a really hard challenge to overcome. And just to extend your question a little bit, I think another question, maybe a little early for your audience, so apologies, but does everyone need to go to grad school? Certainly not, I don't think. And sometimes I think in America, there's definitely this kind of system, that this channeling of, you should follow these steps, but I think you really need to assess for what I want to do. I could probably, if your objective is to have like a stable financial income, you often don't need to go to grad school, but I don't think students are always given the information to make an informed decision and the support to really think it through carefully.
And I also think, in addition to not being given enough information, I don't know if the high school brain or even the young college brain is ready to make these decisions. The maturity of what they're taking on financially or deciding for the rest of their life. And a lot of times when they come to me, how do you know? Like, I don't know what I want to do for the rest of my life. And I sometimes say, you just need to make a decision what you think you might want to do in September. And it's okay, speaking to what Danielle said, it's okay to go to college in September and decide, you know what, I don't like that college. I want to try a different college. And it's okay for you to go to college and say, that didn't work out. And those aren't failures. You learned something about yourself, because they're still growing and maturing a great deal at 18 years old.
Team meetings where we talk with, why am I teaching this in kindergarten? Okay, how does that look in first grade? How does that look in second grade? Where's the end result in fourth grade? And then I'm sure people feel that, there isn't enough time to speak with our colleagues at the middle schools and at the high schools. So and then, never mind our folks in higher education. I mean, yeah, there's never enough time, I guess. I have a better understanding of sort of like where my little 5 and 6-year-olds, what's the destination for them, and I think, it depends. That's the big takeaway, that it depends on so many things. Will they go to college? Will they go to grad school? Will they finish high school? And but I think it's good for students out there to know that from kindergarten on all the way up, people are pulling for them.
I do want to close from my side by saying that although I started with a provocative statement by of education not being a basic need, I do want to say that, of course, all I was trying to say is that education can come anywhere in any form. Schools may stop temporarily, but the learning cannot stop.